speak on items within the jurisdiction of this committee, but not on today's agenda? Yes. Okay, seeing none, let us go to the very first item.
Okay, so we have two items today. One relates to a loan to the People's Self Housing Corporation, and the second is a broad discussion of a few topics related to the 2014 recommended budget. But we'll start with item one, if that's okay. And I'll turn it over to David Rowell, the Housing Project Manager, or Planner, I should say.
Good morning, Chairman Francisco and Finance Committee members. I'm David Rowell, Housing Project Planner. Staff recommends that the Finance Committee consider and recommend to City Council that they approve the request for People's Self-Help Housing Corporation for $900,000 of home funds for the development and construction of low-income rental housing located at 510-520 North Salsopueda Street and 601 East Haley Street. Funding for this project will satisfy a July 31st, 2013 deadline the city faces for committing federal home funds. The City of Santa Barbara receives federal home funds annually that are used to promote affordable housing through activities such as acquisition, rehabilitation, new construction, and tenant-based rental assistance. People's Self-Help Housing was selected from a request for proposals issued by the city in March.
Mr. Rowell, what's the deadline that you're speaking of?
The deadline is July 31st, 2013 for a commitment of funds.
And so if that money weren't committed, what would happen to it?
We would have to file for an extension with HUD and potentially be able to keep our funds, but it is at risk.
Okay, thank you.
The project site consists of 3 contiguous parcels on the northeast corner of Haley and Salsopuedas. The property is zoned multifamily housing and is located near Ortega Park and Santa Barbara Junior High School. The combined area of the site is approximately 41,000 square feet. People's Self-Help acquired the property with financial assistance from the city's former redevelopment agency set-aside funds in the form of $2 million of acquisition loan. The project includes 8 home units for extremely low, very low, and low income, 47 units for extremely low, very low, and low income tenants. Included in that is 8 home units. 5 of the units are 1 bedroom, 27 are 2 bedroom, and 15 are 3 bedroom units. Included is community space and an on-site laundry facility. Several of the 1-bedroom units will be used either primarily for residences who are homeless or at risk of being homeless. People's Self-Help Supportive Housing Program assists residents with utilizing community services and also provides direct hands-on assistance. The project construction will begin in December 2014, and People's Self-Help anticipates the project will be completed by January 2016. This time frame meets the home requirement that a project be completed within 4 years of the commitment of funds. People's Self-Help seeks $900,000 in home funds from the city to help pay for pre-construction and construction costs. The project total cost is $15,974,181. People's Self-Help serves as the sole developer, owner, and general contractor for the project, and its affiliate, the Duncan Group, serves as the management agent for the development team. Through sustainable design and building methods, the project will promote energy efficiency and conservation. The financing plan utilizes several funding sources, including 9% low-income housing tax credits, which will pay off a $9,613,000 construction loan. The previously provided RDA housing loan and the requested home loan will help People's Self-Help obtain additional financing and provide needed leverage for low-income housing tax credit application. As you can see, in addition to the city funding, People's Self-Help Housing is receiving funding from various sources. People's Self-Help will create a limited partnership to own the project in early 2014, and they will submit the low-income housing tax credit application to the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee in March of 2014 for low-income housing tax credit awards allocated in August of 2014. During the initial 15-year tax credit compliance period, People's Self-Help will maintain operational control of the property by master leasing the improvements from the limited partnership. People's Self-Help has completed numerous successful low-income housing tax credit projects in the South Coast, including Dahlia Court Apartments in Carpinteria, Casa Las Granadas in the city of Santa Barbara, and the El Patio Hotel in Ventura. The proposed $900,000 home loan will have a 30-year term bearing a 3% interest rate with a maturity date of 2043. Payments will be due on the loan on a residual receipts basis. To satisfy home requirements, the proposed $900,000 loan must be committed by July 31st, 2013. Of the total amount committed, 60% must be spent by July 31st, 2016, with an initial disbursement by June 30th of 2014. These funds will be used for pre-construction and development costs. The balance of the proposed loan will then be used towards construction cost, and the project must be completed by July 31st, 2017. People's Self-Help is a qualified community housing development organization, also known as a CHODO, meeting HUD's requirement pertaining to experience, capacity, and board representation. HUD requires that 15% of each year's home funds be used on affordable housing projects developed by CHODOs. The proposed home loan would therefore meet HUD's 15% CHODO requirement. Long-term affordability. The affordability control covenant that was recorded at the time of acquisition requires that the property remain affordable to extremely low, very low, and low-income residences until the year 2102. There will be 8 home-assisted units. The home units will be designated as floating units. A floating designation provides People's Self-Help flexibility to maintain the home-assisted units throughout the affordability period, although the specific units designated may vary with availability.
What is a home-assisted unit?
It's a unit that has a certain qualifications under the home regulatory requirements in terms of rent and income. What a floating unit is that actual unit number can change depending on availability.
So how would these units be distinguished from other units on the property?
It's based on the affordability of the tenant that's occupying it and the rent that's charged.
So they're lower than the other?
Yes, they are lower. Correct.
Mr. White?
Thank you. To just follow up on that, can you compare that to we have this low, very low, and extremely low, very low, and low, and now how does home fit into that package?
I'd be happy to. What you have is extremely low is 30% of area median income. Very low and low are 50 and 60%, and each has different levels of rent. Excuse me for a moment, I got to put on my glasses to look that up. Just to give you an idea, for a home 1-bedroom, the rent's $951. For a 2-bedroom, it's $1143, and for a 3-bedroom, it's $1312. For a very low, it's $746 for a 1-bedroom. Remember, very low is 30%. $896 for a 2-bedroom, and $1,035 for a 3-bedroom. Does that answer your question?
And then home assisted?
I'm sorry. The home assisted was $951 for a 1-bedroom, $1143 for a 2-bedroom, and $1312 for a 3-bedroom. Now, there's 2 different categories of home. There's high home and there's low home. I just read you off the high home designation. 2 of these units will be designated low home, which those rents are $746, $896, and $1,035. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. In conjunction with the proposed home loan, the affordability covenant will be amended to incorporate the required home affordability and compliance provisions. People Self-Help has been one of the city's longtime affordable housing partners. Their mission is to provide affordable housing and programs leading to self-sufficiency for low-income families, seniors, and other specific needs groups. People Self-Help is the recipient of numerous local, state, and national awards acknowledging its leadership and performance in the affordable housing field. They have long-term staff with extensive experience in affordable housing development and management. High house prices and high rents combined with low supply of affordable housing opportunities make this project ideal for the city of Santa Barbara. Both the 2010 to 2014 consolidated plan and the housing element state that the city places the highest priority on supportive, affordable housing and emphasizes the need for low-income multifamily housing. According to the housing element, a majority of rental units are studio or one-bedroom. Units for large households are hard to find and less affordable. This project would provide a combination of 1, 2, and 3-bedroom units with a minimum of 30% or 15 units containing 3 bedrooms. The requested home funds for this important community-serving project result in a home unit subsidy of $112,500, which is below the maximum allowed of $152,000. In addition, the total city subsidy per unit is only $61,702, which is lower than the typical city subsidy of $120,000. The request requires no additional city funding and does not change the terms of the former RDA acquisition loan. Staff supports the proposed loan and requests that the Finance Committee recommends that City Council approve the $900,000 home loan to People's Self-Help Housing Corporation. This concludes my presentation. I'll be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Okay, questions from committee members. Mr. White?
Thank you. Can you describe where this project sits in the permitting process?
Chairman Francisco and Finance Committee member White, it's in the early planning stages. There's been discussions with our planning department. In fact, there was a revision to the bedroom count recently. So very early, some of the early expenditures are going to be on engineering and architecture. So we're pretty close to the beginning.
Okay. And has an architect been chosen for the project yet?
Yes.
Can we know who that is?
The architect is Detty Piker.
Okay, great.
Sure. Introduce yourself.
Morgan Benavido. I'm sorry. Morgan Benavido with People's Self-Help Housing. I'm the project manager for this project. I was at the architect's office earlier today before we stopped by here, and we're planning to submit for architecture board review, conceptual review today. So you should get an application later today, or your office get an application later today. So that's where we are in the process.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Ms. Murillo, any questions? Mr. Rowell, so if I understand this correctly, this money can only be used for this purpose, correct?
The city had a request for proposals in March, in which we got 4 applications. There's regulations as to how you use home funds. So in answer to your question, we've determined that this was the highest and best use for our home funds, but it can be used for things such as acquisition, construction, tenant-based rental assistance.
Okay. Thank you. All right. If there are no further questions.
I'll make a motion.
I would move the staff recommendation then. Oh, we have public comment. Sorry.
Oh, on this topic. Okay.
Mr. Chair, members, thank you for your time. I oppose granting self-help housing $900,000 of taxpayers' money. I oppose it on the grounds of the violation of the Fair Housing Act and violation of due process. On February 11th, 2011, I presented an application to the Victoria Hotel, which, according to the sign in their window, is a part of People's Self-Help Organization. The management sent and received back their reference form to my former rental owner via Caridad. In a chance conversation with the portfolio manager for the Victoria Hotel, Carlos Jimenez. He stated that he had a problem with my application because 2 answers were checked in the negative, that I did not follow house rules or the lease, and had problems with renters or guests. I later spoke with Ms. Shull, the property manager at Villa Caridad, who had sent the referral form, saying that these allegations had no merit. She agreed, recanted, and sent that information to the Victoria Hotel. I asked Mr. Jimenez for a hearing. He denied that request. He stated that he was going to use the answers in the original referral form, knowing that the answers he objected to were recanted. His attitude was belligerent and demeaning. He denied renting to me at the Victoria Hotel. The Fair Housing Act in part states that the Attorney General shall commence a cause of action if there is a reasonable cause to believe that any person or group of persons, quote, is engaged in a pattern or practice of resistance to the full enjoyment of any of the rights granted by this subchapter, end quote. I have the quotes in the paper here, or the citations. When government awards, this is not a quote, when government awards a contract to a private firm with the knowledge of a firm's discriminatory practice, the government becomes a joint participant in private discrimination. Many of the court cases dealt with discrimination against blacks. They established the legal obligation to deny that which impinges with too many dire consequences upon rights enjoyed by first-class citizens, such freedoms as to choose housing, the right to be free from conspiracies, and to deprive rights on the basis of invidious discrimination. Equal protection of the laws shall be enforced. By accepting government money, people's self-help housing must comply to the 14th Amendment obligation to due process and equal treatment, which Mr. Jimenez violated by denying my application and a hearing. The purpose of the Bill of Rights in general, and the due process of the 14th Amendment in particular, in addition to the due process stated in the California Constitution, is to protect the fragile values of a vulnerable citizenry from the overbearing concern for efficiency and efficacy. Due process of law is the primary and indispensable foundation of individual freedoms. It is the basic and essential term in the social compact which defines the rights of individuals and delimits the powers which the state may exercise. The fundamental guarantee of due process is absolute and not merely relative. It does not have regard merely to the enforcement of the law, but searches also the authority for making the law, and it is not merely a political right, but it is a legal right assertable in the courts. In my discussion with others, I have heard similar stories such as mine, but all you need is one. I have the documents to prove my case. I believe this committee has the legal mandate to deny or delay this money to self-help housing until facts can be ascertained. I kindly request that a committee be formed with subpoena power or ask the grand jury to investigate. And I conclude with access of taxpayer money to people who hurt people is unacceptable. I thank you for your...
Thank you, Mr. Burke. Okay.
Well, Mr. Chair, while I certainly have concerns about Mr. Burke's comments, I feel like that's a specific instance as opposed to sort of a systemic conceptual process we're looking at here with the financing. I do hope that that the dispute can be resolved in a way that is deemed fair. I think there are processes for further redress, and I would not want to hold up this step in the process as sort of hostage to a particular dispute. So I still would move the staff recommendation.
Okay.
I will second the motion at the same time that I honor Mr. Burke's positions. So onward with People's Self-Help Housing, which has an excellent reputation. Thank you.
Okay, if there's no further discussion, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Very good.
Okay.
Mr. Samario.
Thank you. So we have 4 or 5 topics to discuss today. We're going to start with a discussion of the infrastructure deferred capital. That was a request specifically of the chair, Mr. Francisco. Chris Anderson, Public Works Director, will be presenting that report.
Okay. Ms. Anderson, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. This is an overview that's focused on the facilities building side of things and the street maintenance side. So I'm not really covering the entire gamut of all of the systems of deferred maintenance, but I think these are potentially illustrative. And what I've tried to do is take a window of comparability, at least going back 5 years to around the time the Infrastructure Financing Task Force completed their work. So starting with the overview of our general fund buildings, looking primarily at those. This is a slide that we shared with you during the Public Works budget presentation, and it just reflects the distribution of the general fund city-owned buildings across departments. So you can see that it's a pretty good representation of a variety of departments, but obviously recreation, the Public Works corporate yard, and the library and fire tend to have the larger building assets in the general fund. And this also was shared during our budget presentation, but I think it's a helpful capture of the age of our building infrastructure, kind of when those investments were made starting in 1910 and going forward to 2012, I believe, on this slide. So you can see that the bulk of our city-owned buildings are over 50 years old. And I'm going to talk briefly about how that is reflected in our understanding of backlog. So we've shared that we have an estimated $218 million of deferred maintenance backlog with our city building asset base. And that's split into kind of 2 major categories. One's major capital, which involves structural upgrades and full system replacements and code upgrades. And then we have minor capital, which is a smaller system replacement or component system replacement, may address some code issues over time, and there's generally the ability to have a phased approach. When you're looking at major capital, those are usually a full change out. So, for example, you'll see down below we have the little boxes of categories. If we were doing ADA compliance that required installing an elevator and dealing with some fairly significant structural changes to a building, that would be a major capital. Potentially on a minor capital situation, we could add some ramp or features with doors and access that is a smaller element. But windows and doors can be major. The electrical, plumbing, and mechanical can be entire system replacements once they've reached their useful life. And pretty much everything in a building has a projected useful life. There's the structure itself, which is usually multiple decades. It can be 50 years plus, depending on the type of material that's used for that construction. And within the building itself, the roof may have a 20-year life, depending on the type of material that it's constructed with. The HVAC systems, the electrical, all of those component parts have useful lives that require them to be either refreshed or renewed. And when we talk about major capital, it brings it back to like new condition. So we've really replaced that element. Or another example that you're familiar with, I think, with some of our recent projects, Fire Station 1, some of the major renovation of recreation facilities, bring it back to a like new condition. We add life when we're refurbishing a facility and are replacing the roof or going in and upgrading elements of the internal systems, but it's still progressing in its useful life kind of category. And looking at the large projects that we have forecasted as needed, These are broken out into the minor capital and major capital components for those different types of buildings. So the police building, for example, major capital would basically be a replacement of the building. To continue to project useful life for the building, we could be looking at a fairly significant, and we're calling it minor capital, but it means we're extending the useful life but not creating as new. So as you're familiar with that building, we've got systems that have already exceeded their useful life for HVAC, for some of the electrical and other component parts. So it becomes challenging to be able to do ongoing minor maintenance because it tripwires and gets into other systems. And so it's hard to isolate projects, and that's been our challenge with that building. Cabrillo Pavilion is another really major rehabilitation project that could have some minor capital investments as well. City Hall, you're all familiar with, lots of challenges there. The library has been a focus for a number of different types of projects, but it is an older building and it has older systems. And then we have a variety of other projects that are identified on this list. Fire stations are another focus that we've had over the last several years. We've really worked hard to try and address deficiencies in the fire station system, but we still have needs. Fire Station 3 is a good example of that. So looking
Ms.
at...
Anderson?
Yes.
Going back to the previous slide for a moment, just so I'm sure that I understand this, the minor capital column, that is, if we don't do the major capital, this is what we would have to spend on minor? That's
a fairly good capture. Usually if we're doing a major capital, we're encompassing some of the smaller repair needs as part of that major project. But without the major capital, the minor capital investment becomes even more critical, because that's where we start to lose the real value of continued use of the structure.
Okay, thank you.
Looking at this history of 2008 to 2013, I think is really helpful, because it shows what an infusion of resource, in this case from RDA, has been able to do to help address some of that backlog need. So in 2008, we had forecasted a deferred maintenance level of about $224.2 million, and today we're forecasting $218 million. And that's over a 5 to 6 year period. So that, comparatively speaking, is also, there's an inflation factor, I think, that comes into play. But the infusion in 2009 and 2011 of RDA projects, such as the Fire Station 1 renovation, the East Cabrillo, the Cabrillo Rec Center renovation, the Fire Station admin building. These were all significant projects that helped to address a backlog need, and I think that's been very effectively used in trying to manage the city's assets. So going forward, we know without RDA, we don't have the likely opportunity to fund major rehabilitation projects for buildings, and that's going to be a continuing challenge. And then I wanted to take you into the pavement maintenance program. A little different set of circumstances, some similarities, but some differences. This is the pavement condition index that you've heard or seen before, and it essentially compares the condition of the pavement with the type of maintenance that would be necessary to continue the useful life of the facility. So once you've, if you start out at good to excellent, a slurry seal program is a way of preventative maintenance. It's not a structural repair, but it is a way of kind of maintaining the surface quality and the protection for the road structure, similar to painting your home. Once you start to drop below 70, which is falling below the good, getting into the fair category between 70 and 50, then you're needing to get into more of a structural repair, a cape seal or a thin overlay. And below 50, you're becoming more and more likely to either having to do a thick overlay or completely reconstruct. And usually there's sort of a combination of both. You're getting into portions of reconstruction and in the pavement prep. But the goal is to maintain and extend useful life. And these are the similar kinds of descriptions of how cost comes into play as you get lower in the quality of the pavement, going from excellent, good, fair, poor, et cetera. The cost to do the rehabilitation work to bring back and extend the useful life goes up. And these are the types of categories that we talked about earlier. The slurry seal or the Cape seal are fairly cost-effective ways of addressing and maintaining a good quality pavement. Once you fall below good quality and start to get into overlay or partial reconstruction, the costs just go up. And the goal, once again, is to kind of revigorate and renew that piece of infrastructure, so you're sort of starting over with the extension of useful life. When we, in 1985, we had a pavement index for the city of Santa Barbara of 59, which is below the good. It's getting between the good and fair and below. And that's the average, so it tells you we had several failed areas. And that was part of the motivation for the Measure D passage that occurred in 1989. The condition of pavement throughout not just the city of Santa Barbara, but our whole area was in very poor condition. And so the focus for that 1.5 cent sales tax initiative was to renew and improve the transportation program. When Measure D passed in 1989, the city created their zone system, and this was a planning approach to be able to efficiently and effectively go in and work on pavement rehabilitation in geographic zones throughout the city, and it enabled the pavement condition to change. And this is starting in 1985 with that pavement condition index of 59 I mentioned earlier. It's really more of a dashed line between 85 and about 1990, because we really didn't have new money that was being able to be put into the road maintenance system. But starting in 89, we had Measure D revenues coming in. And that was a major infusion opportunity for getting in and repairing and replacing roadways. And that bumped us up. So it's almost a dashed line between 1985 and 1990. You can't really read in we weren't gradually improving. We had a quantum leap. And the investment of Measure D funding starting in 1989 going into about the mid-90s, 1995, 96, was a significant increase in the level of funding. I think we had the equivalent of, I'm going to find the amount, 3.6 million roughly back in the 80s and 90s, which has a buying power today of more like 6.9 million. It's almost half of what we are spending today in equivalent numbers. So we got to a point of a 75 pavement condition index, which is very good. And at that point, the challenge became maintaining the level of ongoing contribution to maintenance. And there were challenges with other community interests and needs, and also at the same time, the cost of materials that are used in road rehabilitation was going up fairly dramatically. And so looking at where we are today, we're starting to head back down the pavement condition index trail. And in part, it's because the level of funding that we've been able to apply to street maintenance is roughly been about $2.3 million a year. So it's lower than the 3.5 that we had back in the mid-90s. And back in the mid-90s, that had the equivalent buying power of more like 6.9 million. What we've seen since 2001 to 2011 is roughly 85% increase in the cost of the materials that we use to rehabilitate and maintain roads. So everything's kind of tugging in the wrong direction to really have a sustained maintenance program. So that's why we're seeing the condition index dropping. Currently, we're in the mid-60s, and that's the point when you're between the good and fair category that we showed you earlier on the slides, when you start to need to have an overlay program that's more significant, when you start to get into having to do more costly rehabilitation, and Slurry Seal is not the program that addresses that. So you're getting into higher, more expensive projects for a larger part of your system. And I think the thing that's illustrative in a way, and this is just a quick slide that shows you those numbers, if we were able to, or if we focused on maintaining the pavement condition index of 70, which was the target going back years ago to the adoption of Measure D, we would need about $4.7 million annually to try and maintain that level of quality. But once again, I think the thing that this helps to illustrate, and even the building facility description, when you have the opportunity to infuse some capital dollars, you can make a difference, and you can achieve improvement in the quality and useful life of the assets that the city has. Then the challenge is maintaining a level of ongoing sustained maintenance to hold on to that quality. So I'm available for questions.
Okay. Questions from committee members?
So, you say 4.7 is where we are. What would be needed today, and we're spending
About an average of 2.3.
2.3. So we're roughly half of
Yes.
what is needed.
Yes, and as you'll recall, we've had some challenges in the last couple of years with the slide areas and the areas
Conejo.
affected by, yes, Conejo, and the fire affected areas as well. That's always going to happen. There's always going to be some area that has a driver that makes it deteriorate more quickly than we would like, but that's it.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Murillo, any questions?
Well, thank you. So Measure D was in 1989, and that was a half-cent sales tax.
Correct.
And then it sunsetted, and then they called it Measure A, and people voted for it again.
We actually voted before the sunset. So
that's
about
right.
2 years before Measure D was due to expire, the election to approve Measure A was supported strongly. And it's a measure that is important for funding for local agencies, but it's also been very important for the leveraging of funding for 101 and a variety of other transportation program needs. So it's kind of changed, I think, from what it was in 1985, which was really driven by pavement condition. It has changed over the course of time to a much broader transportation agenda.
Right, so somehow the local governments convinced the voters that it was a good thing. So, and they came out strong. Mm-hmm. That might be a lesson to us when we consider here at the City of Santa Barbara putting forth a sales tax, that it helps with big ticket items like this.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
Thank you.
Mr. Samario, are we going to talk about the 20-year history of infrastructure, the unfunded level over 20 years, or is this part of this?
You know, Mr. Chair, I think we have good data for the pavement maintenance condition going back 20 years. We don't necessarily have the same quality of data going back that far for the other system components that would be, I think, of interest. The building condition, for example, I don't believe we have 20-year-old history.
Okay. So this is a relatively recent concern.
I think that the focus on doing the baseline analysis of condition indexing is relatively new for buildings. Pavement is something that has had a focus much earlier, So that's why the systems that are in place have been around longer.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to continue with other topics. I'm not sure this was specifically requested, but I think there has been some discussion about looking at citywide outstanding long-term debt, and I thought we would show you a schedule of that.
I'd like to make a comment, if I could,
Of course.
about our previous discussion. First of all, I really appreciate staff bringing together that information, and I've asked about this because I think our citizens should hear this on a regular basis, and the annual budget is being one of those good opportunities to take that portrait, that snapshot, or whatever you want to call it, of our city, and have an overall sense of how we're doing. And these are one critical piece of our picture. I think of the one that I feel is the element that is a strong model for how we'd like to see the whole city run is our vehicle system, and where that has turned the corner and is now operating really on it with a strong sense of where we are, what we have, and the funding system appears to me to be one that's very rational, and we hear efficiencies improving on a regular basis, where we find a way to get rid of one more truck or to use what we have more efficiently. And we saw today a follow-up on the infrastructure report that was done 5-6 years ago, whenever that was. We hear about we've certainly had controversy about our wastewater system and the pipes and all of that, but the water wastewater system is one of the real elephants in the room for cost and of infrastructure that we have. And I just picture over time our citizens being able to look out and take this snapshot of the buildings and the pavement, take a snapshot of our pipes and the other key pieces that we're in charge of managing, and have a sense of how we're doing. And obviously another question that I've asked about is debt, and we get to hear about that too. But I just wanted to touch in on this. This stuff can be translated as we saw today into something that's digestible by our citizens. And that's what's important. I think it's important that as we go along through time, that we can give to our citizens this portrait. So thank you. I think this is another good step today, and obviously heading into the debt topic, that's another one as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Of course.
Okay.
Mr. Samario.
Thank you. Thank you for that lead-in. So this is a summary of all outstanding long-term debt that the city has as of June 30, 2012. Clearly, there have been some activity during the current year, repayments of some of the principal or the portions of these, but as of the end of last year, these are the balances, and I indicated the general fund and then all the enterprise funds, at least those that have some kind of a debt outstanding. So as you can see, first, the general fund, they had, as of last year, $1.8 million of debt outstanding. And I also wanted to show you what their annual debt service is this current year. So what are they paying every year? And also then what is that debt service payment in relation as a percentage of their overall operating budget? And I used the fiscal year 2013 budget just to kind of give you a sense. And you've heard this before, that the general fund is really, really well below what would be a typical general fund in terms of averages, in terms of debt it would have. It only has a $1.8 million balance. It's 0.3%. Its annual debt service of $349 is 0.3% of its operating budget. So a very, very small portion of its revenues go toward repaying debt.
So, Mr. Samario, do you know how these other figures would place in a similar?
Yeah, and so for the enterprise funds, I would think that the 10 to 15% range is pretty typical. So I think we're all in that ballpark with our enterprise funds. The airport fund, that's the one bond outstanding that funded the terminal, the new airline terminal. Their annual debt service costs are almost $5 million per year, which is about 15.6%. So you can see for each of the funds, we talked a lot about the water fund in the context of refinancing some of their debt. They have $50 million outstanding as of June 30, 2012, and they have a $1.6 million annual debt service. Some of those are state revolving loans, so the interest rates are pretty low. Wastewater has just one debt. It's a certificate of participation. And then the waterfront has a certificate of participation as well, in addition to a loan they have from the State Department of Boating and Waterways for the Marina One. And that loan will actually start to increase because they're taking out new money over the next few years. And then the golf course just has one debt outstanding. It actually participated. It's the same debt that they shared with the general fund when they made improvements to this facility as well as the improvements to the golf course. Their outstanding balance is $943. It'll be paid off in a few years. But again, even though it's 10% of their operating budget, it's going to go away in a couple of years.
Mr. White?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Samaria. This is, I think a good snapshot for us and for our citizens to see. The waterfront certificate of participation. I know that there was the Marina One is in the process still of being rehabbed. Was that what the certificate of participation was about for waterfront, or was there some other
No, Mr. Chair.
capital? Maybe the rehab of the harbor, of the waterfront staff office. Is that it?
So Mr. Chair, committee member White, the Marina One, and they're going to be doing phases, but the Marina One loan currently outstanding relates to the State Department of Boating and Waterways. The certificates of participation, I got to tell you, it's been a number of years, so I don't recall exactly what it was used to fund, but it was general improvements within the waterfront area. But it's the state loan that's being used to fund the Marina One improvements.
Thank you.
And I can get that information to you.
That would be great.
Sure.
And by the way, if you could send around that PowerPoint that
Sure.
for the previous presentation, that was very useful.
Okay, sure.
I didn't see that. Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to go on to citywide reserve balances in the same organization, general fund and enterprise funds. I'm going to just start with the enterprise funds. These are the balances as of June 30, 2012. So the policy reserves, and I think it's important to recognize that for enterprise funds, they have almost sort of four buckets of reserves, 3 buckets of reserves. One is just like the general fund, they have a disaster reserve requirement, which is 15% of their operating budget. A contingency reserve that's equal to 10%. But unlike the general fund, they have a capital reserve requirement that is actually in some cases larger than their 25%. So, for example, I'm going to just give you one example because it's illustrative. The water fund, their policy reserves are $13.9 million. About $5 or $6 million of that is just for their capital reserve. It's the reserve that they're not supposed to touch. It's supposed to be funded. It's based on the previous 3 years' average capital program funded. So it's money that are maintained and held, and only really in an emergency do we actually tap into those reserves. So it's a much larger number. In fact, if you go all the way to the right, you can see that, whereas the general fund, our target is 25%. In a lot of cases, it's well above that because it's 25% plus then whatever capital reserve requirements they have. So in the airport fund, $4.1 million is their required reserves. They have a little bit over that reserves above policy. And you can see that column I've sort of labeled for capital because really all of that is accumulated for capital, planned, sometimes unplanned, but certainly in the water fund, the $13 million has intentionally been accumulated, and it will likely be spent in the next 2 years, probably for sure in the next 3 years. So you can just see the wastewater fund, they're a little bit under the reserves. We've known this, and we're hoping to get back to where we're above policy. But we knew that with the additional money going toward some of the pipe replacements, they have dipped into their policy reserves. But again, their plan is that over time they'll be fully funded in the reserves. In waterfront, they're $2.6 million above their policy requirements. Part of their reserve policies are met through their harbor preservation fund. They have a separate fund for maintaining capital. It's different than the reserve requirements that other funds are subject to. It's more that they have to maintain a minimum of $2 million, but not more than $5 million in that harbor preservation fund. And they essentially sweep any surpluses into that at the end of each year. Downtown parking, you can see the reserves above policy are almost the same as what the reserve policies are. So for a total of $5.4 million. Solid waste is one fund because we recently transitioned that from a special revenue fund to an enterprise fund. They're well below the reserve requirements. They're $401,000 short of where they should be. And then the Gulf Fund, also because of the issues they've been having with revenues and rounds going down, they are currently below their policy requirements, but they still have a fair amount of money. They're still at 25% of their operating budget in terms of reserves they actually have in the bank. Any questions on this piece?
A comment?
Okay. Not at this time.
Okay. So looking at the general fund now, we're going to try to project what we think it will be at the end of this current year, and this is a rough estimate. We believe that based on the revenues we've seen year to date and the expenditures that we expect to come under budget by the end of the year, that we will have about a $5.4 million surplus in the general fund at the end of this current fiscal year. However, much of that is due to some one-time money we've been talking about that we have plans to discuss in August, July or August, in terms of how we might spend those one-time monies for capital. So $2,088,000 are the property taxes that we received one-time money from the dissolution of the RDA, the reserves that they had accumulated that were eventually had to go back to the county. We got a share of that, 13%. It was really in the order of $2.3 million and some change, but we used part of that to fund the design costs for the 911 call center that's moving from the PD to the Granada offices. The PTAF, that's property tax administration fees that the county overcharged us over a period of 5 years. We got that money, and you can see those two items are asterisk because we, as part of the third quarter, transferred those monies already into our capital fund for further discussion of how we use that. The other two items are also one-time. The insurance settlement, we had estimated a while ago that it would be about $570,000. We have a better estimate. We have not received that yet, but we expect to receive it within a month. And we think now it's around $609,000.
And what is that settlement again?
That was for the loss and the theft that we incurred. That was incurred at the police department. And then we had a property sale that we actually talked about last week as part of our third quarter. There was a property close to the roundabout on Milpas. We actually had not identified this as some of the one-time money in previous discussions with the committee or council. This will be a decision whether we include this as part of that one-time money. It was unbudgeted that we would transfer over into our capital fund along with the other two items. So in any case, when if you back out those items and assume we're going to sweep those over to a capital fund, then really our net surplus is about $1,030,000. And pursuant to our recently adopted reserve policy, half of that would be swept into our capital reserves as well, and the remaining portion of $515,000 would be used to add to our reserve balances within the general fund. Does that all make sense?
It does.
Okay. So that $515,000 is what I used to add to the beginning reserve balances last year. So this is an addition of $500,000 we're adding to last year's balances, and you can see now, how it shapes up. So the first column of numbers represents what our policy says we should have in the bank. And for disaster reserve, 15%, it's $16.6 million. And that's fully funded based on our projected reserves. The contingency reserve, we're supposed to have $11 million. And this will be at the end of this current fiscal year, we're supposed to have $11 million. We currently project to have $7 million and therefore be short about $4 million. And you can see therefore the totals. I also wanted to show you what the reserves were last year for a couple of reasons. One is if you look at the policy reserves last year, they were about $1.2 million less than what they are moving forward to the end of this year. And the reason for that is because, again, because it's a function of the operating budget, it's a percentage of the operating budget. As it grows, so do our reserve requirements. So in this case, our reserve requirements went up by $1.2 million because our budget for next year is projected to grow by about $4.5–5 million. So because it grows, then so do our reserve requirements, even though in real terms our actual money that we have in the bank is sort of not keeping pace. In fact, you can see that this year, end of this year, we're going to be $4 million short, whereas last year we were $3.3 million short. So we aren't keeping up with the reserve requirements in terms of actual reserves we're adding at the end of each year based on results of operations. So again, the point is we added $515,000, and we're expecting to add $500,000 in real terms. But what we're supposed to add is 1.2 based on the growth of our budget. So we've fallen a little behind. But by the same token, we still have $23 million in the bank. That's 0.6. That's a fair amount of money. It's about 22.5% of our operating budget. So it's still a healthy level of reserves. And our goal ultimately, as we generate surpluses in future years, is to start to build that up and hopefully at least keep pace with what our reserve requirements are. Any question on this slide?
No.
So let's look at our citywide unfunded liabilities. This was a request by Mr. White. So on the left, I've identified what I see as the four major categories of unfunded liabilities. The first one, of course, is our pension. We've talked a lot about that. Based on a more recent valuation dated June 30, 2011, our unfunded liability is in the order of $226 million. In terms of context, we're supposed to have about $750 million, and we have somewhere around $525 million, so we're short 226. It's represents a 68% funded level, which is better than it was last year based on the last valuation because of better results PERS experience. But as you know, with rate increases proposed and starting in 2016, the goal is to have that $226 million go away in 30 years, a fixed term of 30 years. All right, we also have a sick leave benefit that when folks retire from the city, all accumulated sick leave hours, that they are able to cash that out or have us purchase an annuity for them. And our unfunded liability for that is 4.9. And I want to just mention the next sick leave and retirement medical and implied subsidy. It's really the way they calculate that is important to understand because it's not necessarily intuitive. So what they require us to do is advance fund all of these liabilities that we expect to pay when somebody retires, right? So over the term of their employment, whether it be 20 years or 25 years, we are supposed to be putting the money in the bank so that when they retire, the money's there. And so they have to make a projection or statistical analysis about somebody who's 25 years old. What's the likelihood that they will stay with the city and actually retire, and how many hours of sick leave will they actually accrue? Because if they don't retire, they just leave the city, they don't get this money. So we have to start putting money aside early on based on a statistical analysis of what's the likelihood that they'll retire and be eligible for these benefits. But based on that analysis, what we're supposed to have in the bank today is $4.9 million that we don't have. And then the retiree medical and implied subsidy, I'll mention again what they are. The first one is a little more intuitive. When somebody retires, based on how many years of service, they have to be with the city at least 15 years. They are entitled to a stipend of somewhere around $300 to $350 per month until they reach age 65. So if they retire at age 62, then we have an obligation for 3 years. If they retire at age 55, then we have an obligation for 10 years. And so as of the June 30, 2011, the valuation date, we have an unfunded liability for the retiree medical and what we call the implied insurance premium subsidy of $34 million. I didn't explain the subsidy. That's where employees who retire can participate in our group insurance plan, and they are able to get then the preferred rate essentially rather than if they were separately rated as a group or individually rated. And so that discount they get on their premium that they pay for, but it's still a discount, is considered a benefit that we're supposed to then, when somebody who's 25, the chances that they're going to retire and then participate, we have to start putting money aside. And according to our actuaries, they indicate that we should have $34 million in the bank that we currently don't have. So we're short $34 million. And then the infrastructure, this is the number I just pulled out of our CIP document. It's a big number. It's rounded, obviously. It doesn't include, as you know, as we've talked about, any potential grant funds or donations that we might get. So this number is likely lower than that because until the grant has been rewarded, we consider it to be unfunded. So this is probably a smaller number, maybe $300 million, not sure, but it's still a big number. That's kind of the point. But this is sort of a grand summary total of all of our unfunded liabilities citywide.
I have a question.
Of course.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just let me pick sick leave. So $4.9 million. So we would owe that to the employees if they retired and wanted to cash out their sick leave. So we don't really owe it right now.
That's correct. We
Okay.
don't know it today.
And then the big number. Well, we'll look at pension, 226 million. So we don't have that, but it's not like people are retiring right now, so we don't owe it to them. I mean, the way you're saying it might panic people that we don't have it. You were short of it. Well,
Right.
that, I mean, there is a time factor. And then, is there a city that has $226 million in the bank waiting for people to retire?
Yeah, those are good observations, and that's a good question. So to give you some context for the pension, as I said, this is going to be a liability that will be paid over 30 years, right? So it's not something that we would consider a current liability. We're not going to have to pay the next 5 years. It's going to be paid over a 30-year period, almost it's like a mortgage. So yeah, is it currently due? Of course not. Is it something we have to recognize that we have an obligation for? And with the thing about the pension, as you know, back in 2000 or 99, that number was actually almost, I don't want to say flipped, but we had a surplus. We had more assets than we had in accrued liabilities, and because of the events of 2001 and 2, that recession, and then the most recent recession and benefit enhancements, all those sort of came together to create this unfunded liability. So some of this will be paid in rates. Some of it could be paid through better than expected performance in investments. If we have a sustained double-digit return on our investments at PERS, then that'll eat into that liability. But it's not due tomorrow or next year, but it is a longer-term liability. Similarly with the sick leave, it's really what it represents is how much we're supposed to have in a bank, but it's, again, we're talking about a funding period of 20 years, 25 years. So no, it's not going to be paid tomorrow. It's just how much are we supposed to have in the bank. And we, in fact, for the sick leave and the retired medical components, we have established starting next year a plan where we're going to start putting money aside so we can start eating into this liability and start becoming more fully funded like our vehicles are, so that we're not falling behind. In fact, we're starting to get ahead of this and start to reduce these numbers to a much smaller number. But it's a long-term sort of plan.
Well, thank you for the information, and I think it is important for planning purposes.
Sure.
Mr. White?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, yes, I agree, and I appreciate your putting this up there. I think one question that I would have about this slide is how this folds into the presentation that Ms. Anderson made with an infrastructure liability number that would be, I think it was 300 or between 2 and 300 million was what I recall that number to be. So then this 435, how does that fit in? Sometime maybe next year at this time or whatever, but this repeated snapshot and again information for our citizens, how those numbers to get a little less squishy might be helpful too. I can certainly see how the water wastewater fund is contributing a chunk of that extra $200 million somewhere in there. So I totally appreciate that. And also, I think that the conversations that Council has had the last few years has helped in changing the reserves issues. And this committee has worked on that, and I think has institutionalized a strategy of that those reserves really are they're critical to the likes of what we just have experienced in the way of a crash, and that we learned that. It's kind of like when the drought came along, how we learned about the importance of water. We really learned about the importance also of the reserves. And one of the projects that we have taken on, and I have to say this collectively with staff and council, is the sick leave issue. It's not a great big number when you look. This is $1 billion. We're looking at most of $1 billion here, or $700 million. Okay, it's only a $4 or $5 million piece, but we're starting to pick at that and make that a planned, strategic expenditure rather than just a blind, oh my gosh, this year we had 10 firefighters retire last year, and how much sick leave was probably a hit that was bigger than we're accustomed to. Well, we're going to start to, like the vehicle maintenance system, deal with it, I think, in a way that's just more sensible. So I really appreciate these. Mr. House isn't here, but we're still going to have an appreciation of the good work that the staff is bringing to us, because I do think this is very helpful for our community perspective of this city.
Mr. Chair, if I could, one thing I failed to mention on our reserve discussion, I think what's important to recognize that over the last 10 years, that even though we're seemingly short on our reserves where we should need to be in our general fund, we have been accumulating, whether it be for vehicles or other purposes, we've been accumulating reserves in other areas where in the past we had none. I think that if we were to kind of combine those reserves that relate to the general fund that are in other places, we are probably in a much better position than we've been in the past.
And just to have a mentality to establish a culture going forward of how we manage our funds and our buildings and our infrastructure, I think that's as important. The mindset is probably the most important piece of this, of just this is the way we do business in Santa Barbara. And that element, it passes along from one generation and one group to the next, and that's what I hope that I know we're contributing to in this short term, and that's what I think is a good idea for, obviously, not just this city, but there's some other jurisdictions that could benefit from this kind of thought process as well.
Okay. Moving right along.
Last item, staff recommended adjustments. These are pretty straightforward. So from the time we filed the recommended budget, pretty typical that we see some things that need to be adjusted, corrected based on new information. There are a couple items here. One is in the fleet replacement fund. You recall that we, for next year, the Gulf Fund is going to borrow money for equipment from the fleet replacement fund, and we budgeted for that. The one piece we didn't budget for is the fact that the fleet replacement fund will see a repayment of the principal and interest starting next year and in future years. So we wanted to provide for that budgeted revenue in that fund, which was not in the current recommended budget. And then you may recall that we talked about that a parking enforcement vehicle, because of the amount of repairs that have been needed, we had scheduled to replace it next year. We're going to replace it this year, so we're just going to reduce the budget next year for that. We're basically shifting from next year to this year. And then you may recall in the Streets Fund, we had Mr. Dayton, Rob Dayton, here to talk about a number of fees that are new fees they're establishing. At the time when we put together the budget, they had not come up with an estimate for those revenue impacts. So this is really just establishing revenues for those items that he discussed. So this is a list of all the topics that the Finance Committee heard over the last number of weeks. And really looking at this point for recommendations from the committee that we would forward on to the City Council on June 3rd. We know that you had asked us for in regards to the Human Services funding decisions that we would just present that entire report to the Council, which we will do on June 3rd. But we're looking for specific recommendations on the other areas, whether to accept them or recommend them as proposed, or recommend any changes to anything we discussed.
Okay. Mr. White?
And Mr. Chair, there's also a discussion that will be had for the bits of excess funds or funds over budget that we have, and that's another conversation that Council will have, and we're not making recommendations on that. That is correct.
That'll also be on June 3rd. We'll be talking about some potential uses of the surpluses that we're projecting.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Ms. Murillo.
Thank you. I think your general fund revenue assumptions are always a little conservative, but I guess that's your job. But when I go to Council, I might make some arguments, because I have some favorite general fund items that I'd like to fund and take a chance that the revenue will come in. I look at the library coming to us asking for $43,000 to increase the book budget. Why is that even a question? Our library needs books. How basic is that? And parks enhancement and those drop-in programs that help our youth. So anyway, I'm just I guess I'm willing to vote for this, but just letting you know that I'm got an eye on those revenue assumptions, and they're a little conservative for me.
Okay.
Mr. White?
Well, I feel like we've had a good summary and rundown of the city's finances in these various meetings, and that we've established a prudent set of guidelines going forward. And I think we're making some. It is so difficult in this era to think of us making progress because we're seeing so many bad things happening. But and I would say one area where I'm which I'll raise also at the extra funds discussion is that we're not, as I'm understanding it, we're still coming up short in our maintenance budget. We're not funding what the infrastructure. Could you perhaps repeat that, refresh that momentarily?
Sure. I think what we're talking about, Mr. Chair and Member White, is the funding toward Jim Dewey's shop.
Correct.
The ongoing maintenance of general fund facilities that we're short of where I think the ideal would be, even though we've added some to that this coming year. But
can you pull those? I certainly couldn't pull those numbers out.
I think their ideal was about $2.2 million, if I'm not mistaken, and then I think we're funding about 1.7.
Okay, all right. So that's an area that concerns me, Mr. Chair. I think that as we start looking at having any bits of money around the place, that we should at least be not losing so much ground in that area. But as I say, as a whole, I think that we're doing a prudent job with the money and the resources that we have at this point. And I move that you need a motion on this?
Yeah, and just to kind of help, I think the items where we would look for a recommendation are the first three items, and then the last item, because the other items, the time and human services funding decisions, we're going to be taking to them with no recommendation. The unfunded liabilities discussion, citywide reserves, the PERS rate increases, those are just items of information, unless you felt like you wanted to, it would cause you to create or make some changes to the budget because of what you've heard. Otherwise, the first three and the last item, we look for a specific recommendation on whether to approve them or not approve them.
And I would move to approve them, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
And I would second it, but I guess I want to ask, because you were talking about the Mr. Dewey's numbers. I mean, didn't we just put a whole bunch of money into capital reserve? Or am I oversimplifying things that money can go for that unfunded?
Mr. Chair, Committee Member Murillo, so the Jim Dewey for building, general fund buildings and facilities, it's an ongoing source of money that goes toward that program to maintain, carpets, paints, and all those painting and all that. So it's ongoing revenue sources that he's going to need. The monies we're going to be talking about in July or August are all one-time funding sources. Okay. So they would be going for one-time purposes. Again, capital, but it doesn't. They don't represent ongoing funding sources that could help Jim Dewey in the long term.
Thank you. That was the second.
Okay. So, if there's no further discussion on those four pieces of this, all those in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Now, as to some of those other items up there, I think that in addition to talking about the human service funding timing, I think that the PERS issue is also something that needs to go before the full council. Even if there's no action to take. I think that's something is such a significant financial hit coming pretty soon. We need to make sure that both the rest of the council and the general public understands that. Okay. So.
And Mr. Chair, I think also that the information that we've received on the unfunded liabilities, the reserves, and the debt, I think are pieces that would be useful for the council to hear at some point. There's absolutely no hurry on it, but just as a broadening of understanding of our city's system.
We have a 3-hour meeting scheduled We could include the same, presentation that we did on the PERS rate increases and today's presentation on June 3rd. We might go a little bit late. I'm not sure. I think 3 hours is a pretty long period of time, so we can do it at that point.
For me, I mean, it's just if there's a quiet time in the rhythm of city business, it may be people may be just tired of overwhelmed with stuff, and that's not a good time. But I just say this is core to our city's system, and it's useful for everybody from the decision makers to all the citizens to have some information on that over time.
Sure. So what would be the pleasure with regard to the other items?
I think a good approach for this, personally, would be we want to discuss the human services funding right away. And the rest of these, I think the PERS rate increases is the most important after that, and then the other two at a later date. I think the human services funding is the only thing that we need to discuss immediately.
Okay, very good. All right, well, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Meeting adjourned.